Sound check, double check, check, check. Again, see if it works. I clipped it in place. I think it's working. Anything more? Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning. It's about time for us to get started with. Needs to be louder? Or. I think it is working now. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Thank you, Steve. So we'll go ahead and open up with a prayer this morning before we get started with our study. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this time of meeting today. Thank you that we can gather and study, that we can share the things that we know and the things that we have learned with others to encourage and uplift one another. Thank you for the stories that we can study about how you have been faithful to your people in the past, so that we can be reminded of how much you care for us. Thank you for the instruction that we can take from your word that tells us how we should act and why this is important and what our part is in this world as we go through our lives. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. So we're continuing on in our study of worship. We spent the last 3 weeks looking at worship that is directed in the wrong or towards the wrong location, specifically as it related to idol worship. And today, I want to look at how the location of worship applies to things. So what can we learn about stories that talk about worship that also include locations of things? And there's a couple of questions that we want to answer as we're studying through this. One of them is, does where we are when we worship matter? Does it make a difference? Or does it affect anything about what we're doing and why we're doing it? That's the first thought. And then eventually, as we work through these things, we want to look at, since the location of worship actually gets brought up quite a bit throughout the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament, what is the significance of that? And what can we learn today that will inform our choices and our understanding of why we're worshiping and where we're worshiping? So the first question, does where we are when we worship matter? Is it significant to God for us?
I don't think it's significant to God nowadays. It used to be. And it is to us depending on what our expectations are, I think, when we gather with others to worship.
Okay, you caught on a few excellent points. She said it's not significant, let's see if I remember, it's not significant to us today, but it does matter who we're with. Any other thoughts?
I think you can worship by yourself.
Okay.
Okay?
The proposal that you can worship by yourself.
Jesus went off and worshiped by himself in a place where he can talk to God closely. And I think oftentimes in this type of situation, individually we don't do as much of that as we should. Okay, so individual worship recognizes the Creator for what he is, both in prayer and in time just being with him and showing the reverence that he deserves. I think that that's the most important. That when we worship in a group, what's the reason for worshiping in this group? Ever thought about that? What's the real reason for worshiping in
Okay, so the point that he made was you can worship by yourself with the example that Jesus often went off on his own to worship. And then finishing with the question of why do we come together in a group to offer our worship?
To answer your question, does it matter where we worship? No. God is everywhere, so we can worship anywhere.
So God is everywhere. We can worship God anywhere. Steve?
We worship together because the Bible has examples of people worshiping together. We follow the example of the first century, especially churches of Christ. We follow the example of the first century. And Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, which you can do a Lord's Supper by yourself, I guess, but it's more powerful when done in a community of believers. The whole idea of Jesus' teaching is living in community with others, so we can learn from others' experiences and others, their truth that they've learned from the truth. Because I don't hold all of the truth myself, but there's other Christians in this church probably that know something more than I do about something Scripture says. So there's an edification aspect to worshiping in community. We edify the Father, but we edify one another by being in community with the Father.
So we worship in groups because we have examples from the Bible, and because when we come together, we can encourage and edify one another. Jeb?
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you were to ask a Jew during Jesus' day or before, they would say, yeah, it does matter where you worship, you know? In fact, Jesus with the woman at the well, right? It
We're
mattered
gonna-
where the Samaritans worshipped. It mattered where the Jews worshipped. And Jesus breaks all that and says, one day, it's not going to matter where you worship. My followers will worship in spirit and in truth. And Jesus, I think, was alluding to a temple not built with wood and stone, but flesh and bone, right? The indwelling of the Holy Spirit.
So Jeb jumped ahead to the end. We're going to get there, though, and we're going to build on some other thoughts to maybe take that idea and flesh it out even a bit more. So what he said was, for the Jews, it was super important where they worshiped. And so I want to take this because, if you may have noticed, most of our comments and points dealt with what we do today. And that's kind of obvious because things are less significant for what happened 3,000 years ago. We're trying to answer the question of what should we do. But I think that there is a lesson that we can learn from understanding what was done in some of these old times and old passages, and why is it different today? So, like Jeb said, in Jewish times, there was a location for worship. So let's look at that a little bit more, because there's a few themes that run through and are connected to having a location for worship that I think will inform us a little bit about the significance of the way that we worship. So what are those ideas of where you would worship? And we're looking at an Old Testament perspective. We're going to use some passages that lay it out very specifically. There's two themes that I want to look at here. The first of them, we'll turn over to Exodus 3, starting at verse 10 for our first passage. So Exodus chapter 3, starting at verse 10, says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh," this is God talking to Moses, "that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" He said, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So in this passage, it has the idea that there's a particular location where the people of Israel have to be before they can meet God. One defined location. If we look at Psalms 99:9, it's a little more of a general statement, but it still carries the same thought. Psalms 99 verse 9 says, "Exalt the Lord our God, and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy." So we today may not have the same perspective on the location of worship or the significance of a location. So what do mountaintops have to do with things? Why is a mountaintop special that it would be the location where people meet with God? And maybe think about that question. I'm going to quickly go through a bunch of other verses, and these are more on the negative side, but we're looking at examples of where worship happens. So I'm going to go through all these quick. Deuteronomy 12:2 says, "You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree." 1 Kings 14:23, "For they also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree." In 2 Kings 16:4, "And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree." And 2 Kings 17:10, "They set up for themselves pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree." In 2 Chronicles 28:4, "And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree." Did you notice the theme? What's the location where worship happens?
On the mountains and under every green tree.
There's a phrase, and it's consistent. And it's the generally understood location where a people would go to meet with a deity. Now, all of these examples are of the negative. It's of a bad thing that the children of Israel are told not to do. But it describes the general understanding. If people want to go meet with their God, they have a whole land to pick from. So why did they pick those places? What's special about a mountain or a hill or under a green tree?
Because what was heaven? In other words, in the first century, when you say heaven, where did you mean? In their language, where did heaven start?
So where does heaven start? Heaven being the place where the spirits live.
Okay, but it's also any place above your head that goes up. And all cultures, not only Christian cultures and so forth, it's just like the lady at the well. We worship on a mountain. Why? Because it's closer to God. Because they consider that physical being elevated into the heavens as being closer to God. A place where they could worship.
So since God lives above us, since the skies, the heavens, what's higher than us represents the dwelling place of the God, if you want to approach them, you physically approach them. And elevation is the way you get there. What about the green trees? Any thoughts on green trees?
Why do they need to be green?
Where's the first place in the Bible where we read about a bunch of green trees? The Garden of Eden. And what happened there? Mankind walked with God. That was the overlapping place where humanity and deity could interact with each other. And so from the beginning, you have the place where man meets with God is a garden, a lush, watered place. Remember that the story of the Bible almost exclusively takes place in the desert. And so the provision, life itself, is often represented through living things, green trees, watered areas. So if you want to meet with a deity, you physically get closer to them, or you go to a place that represents where their influence was, the provision of life. But I mentioned that all of these examples where we read about hilltops and green trees was presented as a negative thing. God narrows things down. And he says, you worship either where the Ark of the Covenant was at the early part of Israel's history, or you go to Jerusalem. They were told not to worship on mountaintops and under green trees, but in one specific location where the temple was.
Actually, they were told to worship where the ark was. And the ark was then taken by David to Jerusalem, to the temple. Remember, temple, Jerusalem is Mount Sinai. So it's also on the mountain.
So worship happened at the ark. And remember, the point of the ark was so that the priest could approach the presence of God. It's exactly the same theme. People were trying to get close to God, either on top of a mountain or under a tree. In the Israelite system of things, God says, don't use that method of approaching me. I'm going to set up a different method, which is I'm going to choose to be among you, and this tabernacle with the ark inside is where I choose to dwell. And then during David's time, he relocates it and builds a house around it, the temple. So we're still looking at location. In this time, if a person wanted to approach God for whatever reason, to offer praise and worship and sacrifice, if they needed to ask a petition from God, there was a location you had to go to make that happen. So that's the first idea. The second idea, backing up a little bit. Instead of just considering worship of a single God, have you ever considered that deities were regional? That while a people would worship a god, the idea that gods were connected to a location, more like the country where that nation held their control, this is an extremely common theme throughout the Old Testament, that gods are tied to locations. And in some ways, that the conflict between gods mirrors the conflict between people groups. So a couple of examples of this, if you haven't thought of it before. The first one is in 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings 17, starting at verse 24. And if you want to connect other themes that we're not going to get into today, but that will come up, this is actually where the people of Samaria get established, that we will come back to when we meet up with the woman at the well discussion, and how the people of Samaria were a different people group than the rest of the Israelites. And this is the beginning of the story of how that happened. So 2 Kings 17, starting at verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, "The nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there, and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came, and lived in Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. This perspective is extremely foreign to us, because it's not the time and the place that we live in. But it is very explicit in describing the way that they looked at the interaction between gods and peoples. When the invading nation relocated peoples, the deity associated with that area was still recognized to be there. It was just assumed that when you're in this land, there's a god of this land, and he has his own rules. That's the standard approach that they bring with them. A second example, one that goes the opposite way, that it's not just people in God's chosen land have to follow his rules, but what happens when God's people are outside of God's land. And this one is from Daniel chapter 10. In Daniel chapter 10, starting at verse 10, it says, "And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come." Here we have a glimpse of what's happening on the spiritual side, that there's an overlap between what mankind does and what's happening in the spiritual realm behind us. And we see that there's conflict there, that Daniel is outside of his country, and to get him help actually took some conflict. That the messenger sent to him basically had to fight to get to him because of where he was and what was controlling where he was. That other nations than Israel were under the power of other beings. So let's go back to our original question. Do you have to be at one location to worship God? Remember, we're progressing through themes, so don't jump so quickly to today, but work through the thoughts. I understand that we're still looking at least 2,400 years ago, but we're getting to where we are today. Steve, saw your hand?
Well, in the Old Testament, like you say, the stories show that God lived with his people when they built the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. He followed them, and they followed God actually in the wilderness. So he was located close to where they were. Now none of them could get super close because God is holy, and only Moses was allowed to go up on Mount Sinai, which Mount Sinai is in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula.
So Steve pointed out how times have progressed, that throughout the story of the Bible, there was one situation at one time, and then as God's plan and purpose came into being, that the way he interacted with people also changed to go along with it. And it actually matches exactly the progression that I'm working through. Because we're trying to understand when we're worshiping, what are we doing? And why are we doing it? How and what purpose? How does it help us? How does it help other people? That's the underlying question that drives all these things that we're studying. And so if we see how God's connection to his people has grown over time, we can understand a bit more of the significance of what we're doing each day. So I know that all of my examples have been old and ancient. So I'd like to use one that is a little bit newer. If we look at Acts 8, we can have a passage that is New Testament. And it still has some connection to the question of where does worship happen? In Acts chapter 8, verse 27 says, "And he rose and went, and there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah." So we're beginning to see a transition here. It's still under the old system where people who want to worship God have to go to the location where you would worship God. This person from Ethiopia didn't attempt to worship God in his own country. He made a pilgrimage to the place where God was. But we're beginning to see an expansion, a different perspective on things, where the focus is not solely on the people who are in the city, or that the people have to always go to the one city to be able to meet with God. We're seeing a connection to non-Jews and members of other nations, and that the people preaching are willing to go and talk to them. That this nation-specific or city-specific or even mountaintop-specific way of encountering God is being changed. And many people have mentioned why that is and how we do things today. This has been the goal from the beginning. Isaiah chapter 2 has a prophecy of this. Isaiah chapter 2, starting at verse 1, says, "The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." So without getting into it, but I want to acknowledge its existence, this passage is used for people who argue that prophecy says God's kingdom will be reestablished at a physical location in Jerusalem. And again, I don't want to touch that side of things today, but just caution that interpreting prophecy is difficult. and there can be multiple fulfillments of the same passage. But looking at this from the perspective of worship, of how does mankind come to meet God? Also, remembering what we just talked about in Acts, that the word, when the apostles were preaching, was spreading out from Jerusalem. That they weren't telling the people, you all have to become Jews and go back to this city, but they were telling them, God is coming near to you. That the law was flowing out from where it started, in a single location. Remember also from John 18:36 that Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And so spiritual fulfillments of things can be described in physical ways. But now I'd like to move on a bit to the woman at the well discussion, because there in John chapter 4, we have some questions and some answers being asked that are specifically related to the question of where do you worship? And it contains some of the same thoughts that we've been looking at. The ideas of mountains, the desire of peoples to come and find God, to do what he's asking. So let's look at that passage for a little bit to try to see what we can understand. And now I do want to look at what we're doing today, instead of trying to limit our perspective to the old context of how it was written. So I'll start off by reading John 4, verses 19 through 24. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. I know that there's a lot of ways that you can go with this. There's a lot of theology contained in this. So let's try to look at the question that the woman raises. Because although it's written as a statement, it does have the question in it. Where do we worship God? We've had 600 years, at least, of the Samaritans and the Jews, both trying to worship the same God in different places. You have this generational conflict of we're both saying that we're doing the same thing, but we have this disconnect in the way we do it, specifically in the location. And we know in this story that it was just the standard. The woman knew that Jews didn't accept Samaritans. And so she wants to know, we have this divide, what's the answer? It's an honest question. But what does Jesus say? And I'll be honest from the beginning. There are different ways that you can interpret this passage. And so what I'm proposing, I'm not saying that it's the right answer or the only way to take it. But think about how the woman asks the question, where do we worship? We've got two choices. What does Jesus say? Does he give her an answer to the location question? Priscilla? So Priscilla said that he does answer the question of where, but that there is a shared experience aspect to it. That it's not just a statement that says, wherever you find yourself, there is God. But that it's a perspective shift from location to connected people. Did that capture? Okay. Did you have a thought?
I was interested in in 25, the woman says, I know that the Messiah is coming, and the one who is called the Christ, when he comes, he will teach us everything. So she was open to new information. I don't know that she talks to him and says, you're talking to me, and that's a surprise and all that, but she was open to new information, whether they could do it in her hometown as a horrible old Samaritan or not, and he just went right with that. And I think sometimes we need to, maybe we wouldn't miss quite as much sometimes in different situations with people if we were open to other ideas. I mean, she couldn't just been scared to death, period, and turned around and ran. I would think that would be a fairly common reaction for her, actually, but she didn't.
So the point.
She was on her own land.
Yeah, she was. She was in her country, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was Jacob's with her. Okay,
But she was acknowledging him as her superior, whatever. And he was a man.
but she didn't recognize him as a superior until he told her about himself.
Yeah, but then she says, I know that the Messiah is coming. And yeah, I mean, she went with it, is what I think yes, I hear you, I understand, and I'm prepared, she let him know. And then he spent all that time with her, which in turn brought all those other people in, that kind of thing.
So the comment was that she was open to hearing instruction. She asked a question and was willing to listen to the answer to it. And remember through the book of John that this is my own description of it. The theme of the whole book is people asking physical questions and getting spiritual answers, or completely missing the point. And this is another good example of that, where she asks a question from her perspective, thinking that the answer is one of two things. And what Jesus tells her is a completely different perspective. The answer doesn't align with what she has known so far. That there's a spiritual significance to these physical actions that have been happening for generations that were missed. So I think that we've gotten the significant points out of this passage. That if the question you're asking is, whether a specific location makes your worship to God more significant, that the answer is no. That it's more about your heart and who you're with than it is about where you happen to be standing. To back up this point, I have.
It's interesting that John, what's the overall question asked John? Remember, he wrote this about 90 AD, okay? So all the other disciples are dead and so forth. He's living in Ephesus. What was the question, the major question that was asked John? The question would have been, who is this Jesus? And that's why he starts at 1:1 about him being the Word. And then he proceeds to go through and tell about John the Baptist and so forth and so on. And then he gives us two people. He gives us a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who is the best of the best. If you take a look at, he is a Pharisee on the ruling council. So he is followed, as a Pharisee, he is following God. Then on the other side is this woman at the well. She's divorced. Then she's not even living with a husband. And she's a Samaritan. And so forth. And what Jesus, and I think John is trying to write, is, and if you look at it together, Jesus effectively talks to them the same way. The best of the best and the worst of the worst. Because they are all people under God's eyes. Ta-da. Sorry.
I've got two more passages that I want to go to. Both of them are trying to tie up what we understand about where to worship, and since it was significant in the past, how does it relate to what we're doing today? Let's turn over to Jeremiah chapter 7 for the first of those. Jeremiah 7, starting at verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word, and say, Hear the word of the Lord, all you men of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice with one another, if you do not oppress the sojourner, the fatherless, or the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your fathers forever. That just being in the land wasn't enough. They couldn't claim that because they were tied to the location where God was, that gave them a right to everything. God still had a way that he wanted to be worshiped. He had a way that he wanted his people to live and act. And the location wasn't enough. So now to tie it all up, I think we've answered the question of whether there's a location we need to be to approach God. And the answer to that was no. We saw that instead of a physical location, the people that you're with and the reason that you're gathering is what makes it significant now. But what are we accomplishing through this service and this worship? Remember back to the idea of lands that were not Israel being under the control of other spiritual beings than God. So since we're now outside of the land, what are we accomplishing through our worship? Let's turn over to Matthew 28. So at the very end of this book, the last thing that Matthew records as Jesus telling his people to sum up the purpose of his followers. Matthew 28, starting at verse 18. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." In this one passage, Jesus claims dominion over the entire earth. But that doesn't mean that the people of the whole earth know who he is. And that's where his followers come in. He gives them a part in spreading the news, in going out and affecting a change in these other nations. He also says that they're not going to be on their own, that the situation won't be like Daniel, who had to wait 3 weeks before he got an answer, but that he would be with his people in these other nations as they're spreading information about the true God. And so while we started with the question of where do we worship, which is, it's a question that's focused very much on ourselves. We ended up at a different place, which is when we understand how we're worshiping and where we're worshiping, what is the purpose? What does that worship accomplish? That our presence outside of God's land, in the midst of a nation that doesn't know God, and surrounded by people who don't worship God, that our worship and our actions in serving has a purpose that's not just about us. There's certainly that aspect of what we gain from the worship that we do, and when we need things from God, that we approach him to ask for it. But there's the sending part. There's the job that we've been given that takes place where we are, wherever that may be. That's everything that I've prepared. It took 8 weeks, but we finally got through all of my full notes for a week in 1 week. Maybe I'm getting better at editing. But any thoughts on what we've covered this morning? Priscilla.
I can't stop thinking about just like how there's always exceptions to the rule as far as locations. I know that there's like designated places like the temple and all of this stuff, physical places. But I'm always overwhelmed with like gratitude that there's examples of people like in prison worshiping and God is there with the Holy Spirit there. So it's like it is sort of like this amazing shared experience that can happen anywhere. You know, this worship experience can happen under any circumstances anywhere. However, you know, I love how God works. That's all. I'm just trying to say I love how it works. It's good.
Jeb?
I had to step out and use the restroom. Did you guys talk about Abraham and his altars in the Promised Land at all?
We didn't get to that one today.
It just makes me think about that where he was worshiping God in a foreign land was almost like bringing God to that land in some ways. I think about that where
nothing further, I'll go ahead and close us out with a prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for your promise that you are here with us. Thank you for the hope that we have that no matter where we are, you give us strength, whether it's at peace in the assembly of fellow Christians, or whether we find ourselves alone in a prison, that you are with us to strengthen us. And we know that the things that we do can help your purpose and have an influence on those around us. And whether we see the results of these things or not, we trust that you recognize